Hello and welcome to the Swine Disease Reporting System. This is the report 56. We're going to cover the findings from the previous month, the month of September. My name is Edson Magalhães here at the SDRS studio.
Hi, my name is Giovanni Trevisan here at SDRS.
Hi, my name is Guilherme César, also at SDRS studio.
Hello, Daniel Linhares with the SDRS.
And today, we're going to cover the findings, as I mentioned, in terms of PCR detection for the agents that SDRS record data, and also disease diagnosed from ISU VDL. But also after that, after discussing the major findings from the previous month, the month of September, we're going to have a discussion with our invited guest here today. So today we have the pleasure to have here Dr. Andrew Bowman joining the SDRS podcast. Dr. Bowman is currently an associate professor at the Ohio State University Department of Veterinary Preventive Medicine, and he got his VDM, master's, and PhD at the same institution, the Ohio State University, working with viral epidemiology and veterinary public health. Dr. Bowman currently works in the Animal Influenza Ecology and Epidemiology Research Program, developing research focusing on the One Health concept of bidirectional disease transmission from swine to humans and from humans to swine and agricultural affairs. Dr. Bowman, welcome to the SDRS podcast. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Looking forward to talking about some of our research that we've been doing on influenza and as you mentioned, the importance of that bidirectional transmission from pigs to people and people to pigs.
That sounds pretty exciting, Dr. Bowman, and we look for that. Before we enter that, let's do some brief update of what's going on in the SDRS report in terms of agent detection. So, Guilherme, could you provide us what's happening there?
Yeah, regarding to PRRS virus in our first page of the report, the detection of number of positive sub-emissions is within expected for this period of the year. But when we move to the state level monitoring, specifically for the win to finish category, we are having an early increased activity for the virus in South Dakota, Nebraska, Missouri, and Oklahoma.
And when you see those increased activity, what that means for the field, and what's the implication of that?
Well, according to our advisory group, that increased percentage of positive sub-emissions for all these states are expected for this specific period of the year, and they are not seeing any atypical PRRS break being reported. But however, the increased activity in the growth finish is relatively early for this time of the year and reminds us that we have to keep the alert for biocontainment and biosecurity measures to prevent further spread, mainly for cell farms.
Mm-hmm. And how about enteric coronavirus?
Well, regarding the enteric coronavirus, we are having good news about PD, for example, that is still above the expected, but when we move to state monitoring level, nowadays we are having just 3 states with increased activity. If we compare for June, for example, that we achieved 6 states, now we have less of them, and these 3 states are only Iowa, Kansas, and North Carolina that are having this increased percentage of positive submissions. And moving to the Delta coronavirus, we also have good news that we stay with a very low overall percentage of positive sub-emissions. And in the week 38 of the year, that is the second week for September, for example, we test 151 submissions for this virus, and none of them were positive sub-emissions. So we are having good news for this enteric coronavirus.
That's great news, and on top of that, we have TG that has not been detected since April of 2020, so good news there. And how about Mycoplasma pneumoniae?
Yeah, moving to Mycoplasma pneumoniae, we are having a moderate increase in the percentage of positive sub-emissions, mainly in the win to market category.
Any comments of what would be a field implication of this?
Yes, our advisory group highlighted that most of these cases of mycoplasmas occurs as a part of the swine respiratory disease complex and are typically related, for example, with PRRS virus activity in the win to market category that is opening doors for other agents, for example, mycoplasma and also influenza cases.
Well, talking about influenza, what is the news for this month on influenza and highlights there?
Yes, now the SDRS, we are adding the influenza subtype in PCR detection in our report. You can see this chart in the same page of the influenza overall detection. And we have some highlights about that, for example, since 2020, H1N1 is the predominant one, the subtype predominant detected for influenza. And also what we would like to highlight is the number of mixed infections that we have over 5% of these mixed infections since 2020. And for example, 33% of the submissions of the mixed infections were identified in just one animal sample, such as lung tissue, nasal wipe, or nasal swabs, for example, which means that one of these animals were infected with more than one strain.
And what our advisory group tells us about that, there is some implication that they highlight there.
Yeah, our advisory group highlighted that multiple strains are circulating in the production system, and they monitor influenza mainly when they have clinical signs on the farms for vaccine updates, for example. But also the producers that are implementing routine monitoring for influenza are using oral fluid from multiple sites to update the vaccine strategy and also monitor for swine respiratory disease complex cases.
Great comments. Thank you, Guilherme.
Very good, guys. Thanks for the comments. So these were the highlights from the SDRS for the previous month. Now moving to our conversation with Dr. Bowman. Dr. Bowman, your research group published data about the importance of wild animals or even exotic domestic animals regarding influenza surveillance. So, for example, the sea duck samples tested for influenza with an H4 gene highly divergent from most North American lineage and aerosol transmission from infected swine to ferrets in agricultural fairs. Could you summarize to our audience the importance of these non-domestic species in the influenza virus bidirectional disease transmission?
Yeah, so when we think about influenza, we have to remember that we're dealing with a multi-species or multiple host species problem. And so oftentimes we get our blinders on and we think about, influenza in the pigs, or we think about influenza in birds, or we think about influenza in people. Yet when we trace it all back, right, it's all type A influenza. And the real root of the problem here, and as you guys just kind of highlighted, the mixed infections, whether that's within the species or movement between species. We know that when we have movement between species, bad things happen, right? If you just think about the human side, that's where pandemics come from, right? Every human influenza pandemic has originated from animal to human transmission. But if we think about all that diversity of flu viruses that we're dealing with in the pig side, right? Those are all results of other ways direction, right? That's a human to swine transmission for the most part, although some of that is also wild bird, transmission into pigs. So as we think about transmission between species, that really is the issue with influenza. It's a giant game of who's giving what to whom, and we just seem to create more genetic diversity, especially within the pig population. For whatever reason, the pigs seem to hold on to whatever they get and just add it to the pot, whereas other species, it seems to knock them out, or knock out some old diversity and replace it with new.
And Dr. Bowman, going back to the agricultural fairs, your group has been active on that, right? Of course, a lot of contact between pigs, people, some other animals too. And so, what are your general comments around that, the highlights on that interaction as far as bidirectional transmission of influenza?
Yeah, the agricultural fairs are an interesting place for zoonotic transmission of influenza. Oftentimes we really don't think about the show pigs as a major contributor to the swine industry. They only make up about 1.5% of the total pigs in this country. However, they are the pigs on public display, right? You can't push your stroller down the center aisle of a finishing barn and eat a snow cone while you're doing it, but you sure can at a agricultural fair. And so we create this kind of environment where we have lots of people and we have multi-source pigs, and so we're basically violating every tenet of biosecurity, but we're doing it right there on public display. And so that interface has been very active for viruses coming across the interface, especially the swine to human direction. And so, it makes sense. We get a lot of pigs from multiple sources together. We commingle them. Virus amplifies through there, and then we have enough virus that can jump into humans. Most of those cases are the youth exhibitors that are showing pigs that are in direct contact with those pigs. My group's certainly been very active in understanding that interface, largely because, right, every one of those transmissions could be the start of the next pandemic. And so that's why we really have to pay attention to how do we minimize those transmissions, so that we don't end up with another influenza pandemic that might originate right here in the U.S. from a county fair.
And any connection, any evidence of connections or spillovers from what's going on in those fairs back to the swine industry, the commercials?
Yeah, there are. Yeah, we do have some connections of what do we find in those fairs to the commercial industry. I think for the most part, the commercial pigs are the source of the flu viruses we find in show pigs. For the most part, we have flow from the larger genetic diversity maintained within the commercial population. We get a spillover into exhibition swine. Then the exhibition swine are the ones on the public display, and it spills over into people from there. But we do see novel reassortant viruses emerge within those fairs, right? You think about multiple multi-source pigs coming together, bringing their own flu viruses. A new reassortant can emerge within the fair, and then we see some of that spill back into commercial swine. We know somewhere between 10 to 25% of exhibition swine exhibitors report that they have contact with commercial swine on at least a weekly basis. And so, right, we have some of that connection. I think that's where those spillovers are happening, and then we end up with a new reassortant back into the commercial swine. So it's not a one-way flow down. There are novel ones coming back into the commercial swine industry from the fairs.
And you talked about practices to minimize that risk, right? What's your advice to the public audience who will be visiting fairs? What can they do to minimize that risk?
Yeah, I think for the general audience going to fairs, you have to consider the idea that we find influenza at about 25% of the fairs we go to every year. So it's not an uncommon finding. And so you just have to assume it's there. But I think a lot of people don't consider that. So folks at high risk for complications from influenza infection, especially those that are young, old, immunocompromised, may need to consider not going in the pig barns. And then there's other things like not eating or drinking in the barns, washing hands, minimizing how much time you're spending in the barn certainly can help. But then we also have a whole host of other recommendations that we have for the show organizers around limiting the amount of time the pigs are there, so we can decrease generation cycles and not amplify as much virus. And then other ideas, for the exhibitors, like not bringing sick pigs, or, visibly sick pigs to the fairs, or having quarantine isolation pens at home, if they're showing a lot or they have sick pigs.
Those are very good information to share with the swine industry, and thank you for doing those. On this arena of disease prevention by security practice, is there anything else that you could advise our swine stakeholders to take in advantage to avoid any pathogen spillover between, such as the influenza between humans and animals?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general we have the issue of folks that are known ill, right? And so especially if you're sick, you have influenza-like illness, and I know we've just come through the pandemic, and everyone kind of assumes it's COVID. But I think especially for those of us that are around pigs every day, we've got to consider the idea that we're probably bringing. Well, we know humans are contributing more flu viruses to pigs than pigs are to people, and certainly we have incentives to go to work and all that sort of stuff. But we really have to consider those ideas. So I think the self-monitoring of individuals who are around pigs for influenza-like illness, or even rapid tests, to stay away when you're potentially shedding flu viruses, because that's got major implications of one person coming in when they're shedding flu. I mean, it can obviously train wreck a whole system.
Still talking about prevention, Dr. Bowman, your group has some publication about influenza vaccination that can avoid like this bidirectional transmission because you decrease the shedding in the animals, for example. So could you explain a little bit more about difference between vaccines and protocols that we can use to prevent this transmission?
Yeah, so we did a study a couple of years ago looking at vaccinating the animals, vaccinating the pigs at fairs, trying to prevent transmission or at least decrease the likelihood of transmission. The reality is it didn't matter which vaccine we used, and we were using mismatched virus, and so we did, as we know with flu viruses, a better match is results in better protection. In this case, we basically went for the worst case scenario of a complete mismatch with the vaccine strains, and we still saw decreased shedding in animals that were vaccinated, even with that mismatched vaccine. And so the idea that they are shedding flu for a shorter period of time, and when they are shedding, they shed less, right, certainly decreases the opportunity for influenza to make that leap between pigs and people. And that's vice versa too, right? We recommend that swine workers get vaccinated for influenza, just like I mentioned, the idea that if they're vaccinated, they're going to shed influenza for a shorter period of time and decrease the likelihood that they're going to infect the animals that they're caring for. So vaccines have a major role. We could debate all day long about which ones to pick and getting proper matches, but at least in our studies, we had decent evidence that it didn't matter which one. Certainly, some are some would perform better based on antigenic cross reactions, but nonetheless, vaccine was better than nothing. So, especially in those situations, for fairs where we've got those pigs at high contact with people, it makes a lot of sense. I don't know that it makes economic sense to vaccinate every market age pig in the country, right? That's probably a different situation because they aren't in high contact with people, but those pigs that are going to be on public display, I think that's one of those major interventions that we should really push.
But about show pigs as well, Dr. Bowman, do you think we could vaccinate them before they arrive in the fair, for example, like a couple of weeks ago, to have some immunity and avoid this kind of transmission?
Yeah, we've certainly had that discussion of could we do that, and some fairs do, but remember, vaccines don't prevent infection, right? So it might, and as we've seen, we're afraid that in some of those cases, the vaccine may mask, clinical signs and make it harder for us to detect that there's an outbreak. We've seen outbreaks in fully vaccinated pigs where everyone says, oh, they didn't look sick, but yet there's a youngster that's in the hospital because they got infected with the swine lineage virus. And so, I think it's a mixture of things. We can't just rely on one thing. And so saying they're vaccinated and forget about the issue doesn't do it. But I think there certainly are ways. My group's working on doing surveillance, kind of earlier in the show season, seeing how far upstream we can get to identify what strain is predominant. And then we maybe could make a, educated recommendation for vaccine that might be pretty targeted. If we rolled it out right ahead of show season and said, yeah, that's the one to use this year.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, thanks a lot, Dr. Bowman. Thanks for joining us today in this podcast and bringing all this information.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been a blast.
Yeah, so that was it, guys, for this month report. Thanks for joining us, and I'll see you guys next month. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.